Welcome to the Byram Shubert Library, a branch of the Greenwich Library. Thank you all for coming to this wonderful program in association with the Greenwich Historical Society. Before we start, I just want to mention that next week's program, March is Women's History Month, and we're celebrating Women's History Month with today's wonderful program on women's stories from the Bush-Holley House. Next week, same time, but the 10th of March, we will have a lecture, Women in Contemporary French Film, with Professor Anne Kern. Anne Kern is a dean at the University of Purchase. So I hope to see you all. All you have to do is go to www.greenwichlibrary.org and register your name for this wonderful program, Women in Contemporary French Film, with Professor Anne Kern. Thank you so much for all being here. So today I am so happy that we're doing this program in association with the Greenwich Historical Society. And as many of you know, I have two hats on tonight. I'm the branch manager, and I'm also honored to be a trustee of the Greenwich Historical Society. And I'm just going to tell you a couple of things about the Greenwich Historical Society. The Greenwich Historical Society seeks to preserve and interpret Greenwich history to strengthen the community's connection to our past, to each other, and to our future. In pursuit of this mission, the Historical Society is the steward of the Bush-Holley House, a colonial saltbox home dating back to 1730, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Visitors to the Bush-Holley House learn about the house history and occupants during two distinct time periods: the era when it was home to the wealthy mercantile Bush family during the early decades following the American Revolution between roughly 1790 and 1825, and nearly a century later, when the house became the center of a thriving art colony while operated by a boarding house by the Holley family from 1890 to 1920. This is where history comes alive. So please come and visit this wonderful historic house here in Greenwich. The Bush-Holley House is open to the public by guided tour. 8 evocative, well-documented rooms tell a story of change over time, while the historic buildings, landscape, and gardens evoke the turn of the 20th century when Coscom became the first art colony in Connecticut, a cradle of American Impressionism. Tonight, you will hear a series of stories that speak to the key individuals who are part of 2.5-century long history of the Bush-Holley House. We are thrilled to offer the stories of women of the Bush-Holley House as part of our ongoing celebration of Women's History Month. Thank you all for being here. We will start with Kelsie Dalton. And Kelsie Dalton is the Assistant Curator for Interpretation and Collection. Kelsie oversees guided docent tours of the Bush-Holley House and assists with the care and management of the Greenwich Historical Society's museum collection. She received her BA in History and Comparative Literature from Williams College. Our next speaker will be Heather Lodge, is the Manager of Youth and Family Programs at Greenwich Historical Society and longtime partner of the Witness Stories Project, a nonprofit that works to uncover and honors the contributions of enslaved individuals in Connecticut. Heather has a BA in History and Education and an MLS in Ethnology and Folklore from the University of Aberdeen. And our last speaker is Maggie Dimock, is Curator of Exhibitions and Collections at the Greenwich Historical Society, where she oversees rotating art and history exhibitions and manages the museum's collection of fine and decorative art, historic implements, tools and textiles, and other objects of material culture. She holds a BA in Art History and Anthropology from St. Mary's College in Maryland, and an MA in History of Decorative Art from the Smithsonian's Associate and College of Art and Design. Today, it is my pleasure to welcome these wonderful young ladies to tell us the stories of women here in Connecticut. Thank you, ladies.
For that wonderful introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. I'm just going to set up this. So welcome to Their Lives Within These Walls, Women's Stories from the Bush-Holley House, which Miguel just so well introduced. Today, I'm going to be starting us off by talking about Sarah Scudder Isaacs Bush, and she was the Bush family matriarch. The Bushes. The Bush family is part of the Bush-Holley part of the Bush-Holley House. They were wealthy landowners who also owned a grist mill and a prosperous mercantile trading company. When Sarah married David Bush, she moved into the house in Coscob and took over the woman's duties of running the household. The private sphere within the walls of this salt box was her domain. Here we have Sarah's life at a glance. These are two timelines, the top of which really sort of goes more in depth with Sarah's life signposts, whereas the lower one is really some of the major political events within the United States over the course of her life. So Sarah was born in 1742. She married Benjamin Isaacs when she was just 17 years old. And then over the next 10 years of her marriage to him, she had 6 children. Then her husband died when she was just 33, and she remarried when she was 35 in 1777. She marries David Bush, who actually had 5 children of his own, and she moves with 5 of her children to Coscob. So joining their families, there are 10 children in the Bush-Holley house at this time period. Within the first year of their marriage, she has their first son, Eustace Luke Bush, and would be pregnant again in 1797 when David is arrested. So if you look at her timeline sort of in the middle, you'll see General William Tryon's march. That's in 1779. And this was a march made by forces right down Strickland Road, right past the Bush-Holley house, burning everything in sight except for the Bush-Holley house and David Bush's grist mill. And so Patriot Connecticut, Patriot Greenwich, suspected David Bush of being a loyalist, and so they imprisoned him for 3 months. So just imagine Sarah Bush being, how several months pregnant, has a 2-year-old son plus 10 other children, only half of which are her own, and her husband is gone for 3 months. She manages then, she will continue to manage throughout the rest of her life. And just a little bit more about her children. She doesn't have her final child until 1788 when she's 46 years old. She will have been pregnant for a collective 21 years over the course of her life, which is a lot of time to be pregnant. David died in 1797 when Sarah was 55 years old. And it is assumed that from that point on, Sarah took over the running of the house and various other financial responsibilities. She suffered from a stroke in 1820 at 78 and would die 4 years later at approximately age 82, 83 in 1824. This second timeline, I'm not gonna go into it a lot. Hopefully you recognize pretty much everything that's on there, but it just does indicate some of the huge shifts in the political landscape that occur over the course of Sarah's life. And this timeline does not even include the huge technological innovations, changes in trade and fashion, or world events that also occur over the course of her life. So much of what we know from this time period comes from legal documents like wills, simply because they are one of the only records that has been preserved, at least in the case of the Bush family, that really show this history. And they take a lot of work to decode, which Heather will get even more into. So on the left, we have the will of Benjamin Isaacs, who again died in 1775. And he was a wealthy sea captain from Norwalk. His inventory included his house, numerous property holdings, household furnishings, 2 enslaved individuals, and so much clothing. The entire first page of the inventory is just his clothes. The man seemed to really, really like his dress. So Benjamin's distribution of this is pretty straightforward. Sarah gets what's called the widow's third, a third of the homestead and the buildings. She also gets 120 pounds New York money, plus additional funds in trust to help support her as a widow. And she is also bequested an enslaved woman named Dorcas. And then the remainder of the estate is divided among Benjamin Isaac's children. Upon remarriage, Sarah, when she remarries David Bush, or marries him for the first time, Sarah gives up her widow's third. And this is a pretty common caveat in wills from the time. So David's will is more complicated, and this is mostly because he had so much more property and so much more progeny to consider. So I just want to take a moment to touch on what I just said, which was the widow's third. That is Sarah's right after the death of her first husband. So the widow's third was a common law practice that ensured that widows would be cared for after their husband's death. It often included a third of the realty and household tools, which would allow them to continue to support themselves. These arrangements were very, very detailed, including which specific rooms in the house they were allowed to access, and typically specifically allowing the widow's use of connecting hallways or spits of land that she would need in order to access rooms and barns. And this, we believe, necessary because there were some instances where heirs would maybe try to push out those widows so that they could more fully take over the land holding that they had been bequested in a will. Other than giving up her widow's third when she remarried, sometimes the property would also be willed to a widow for only a short period of time. It would have this limitation where it was hers, but only until a male heir reached the age of majority, and then it would actually pass into his hands. And a lot of these difficulties are because Sarah lived before the age of what are known as the Married Women's Property Acts, which were state and national level laws that address the financial and legal limitations placed on women. So these limitations, which were in operation during Sarah's lifetime, and I'll touch on a little bit more later, subsumed a woman's ability to earn wages, own property, sign and enter contracts to her husband's authority. She could not do so once she was married. And again, I will touch on that a little bit more later. But in the slide, you can see in the middle there is an image of the parlor at the Bush-Holley House, which is one of the rooms that Sarah is willed in her widow's third. And then you can also see the hutch and a desk, which are full of books and kitchen utensils, which are also part of Sarah's property. So we're going to take a closer look at David's will. On the right, you'll see a summary of what Sarah inherited in David's will. And we're just going to take a little bit of time to parse out what these bequests might tell us. Well, first of all, these things are an indicator of how incredibly wealthy this family was, and land in particular. It's also interesting to note, I think, and this isn't on the slide, that while David willed land to his 6 daughters, but he did it in such a way that ensured that those daughters could not easily sell it away from the family or even enjoy the full proceeds of such a sale if they were to sell the land after his death. Whereas what Sarah receives, and what you can read in the list, she receives outright. She has a lot of control over the things that are left to her. And I think that this is noteworthy. And I think that this large bequest suggests to us that David knew his wife was very capable of maintaining the household and the wealth that had been built up over his lifetime. Or maybe to put it in a slightly more sentimental way, it suggests that David really trusted Sarah. He knew that she was capable, and he really valued her counsel and thoughts on things. So we start to sort of build an idea of Sarah as this very capable, respectable woman who really knew what she was doing and was able to keep all of her ducks in a row. It also leads us to consider what being cared for meant at this time, and how these carer relationships look and function. So we have things like brothers looking after sisters, fathers looking after daughters. We're going to delve a little bit more into a mother-son relationship, but nothing is a straightforward story. And everything within realty, within wills, within legality, is still operating on a very personal level. So this, we have on the slide, we have a portrait of Sarahbush. And this is a portrait that the Historical Society owns. It's hanging in the Bush-Holley House. And it was commissioned and painted in 1818 by William Dunlap. In the painting, Sarah is 76 years old, and she sat for the portrait just 2 years before she suffered that stroke. And by asking and investigating some questions, we can really tell a lot about her as a person. So what is Sarah wearing? We can see that Sarah is wearing widow's black, despite the fact that her husband had been dead at this point for about 21 years. This could be for a variety of reasons. It could emphasize the power that she held as a widow, as someone who owned property despite being a woman. It could emphasize her power as the head of the household, which she took over after David's death. It could be reminding the viewer of her grief over the loss of a beloved husband. Maybe she just liked the color black and found it dignified. We don't really know, but it does suggest a lot because it's a little bit out of the usual. Also, she's wearing what's called a mock cap, which would have identified her to the viewer as the head of household. So again, really emphasizing this position that she has in the world in her particular family as well. What is she holding? Sarah is holding a book. We can't tell exactly what book it is, but any book at all indicates the fact that she's able to read and that she has the leisure time to read and that she has the money to purchase books. And then in her other hand, she's holding a pair of spectacles, which would have been extremely expensive and a really, truly a luxury at this time period. So both items are emphasizing her respectability, her education, as well as her wealth. And all of these are sources of power during this time period. And so I would invite everybody to consider this last question I asked: why commission a portrait at this point in the point? I think it's a really interesting question. She doesn't have this portrait made of her when she's a young, beautiful woman or newly married. It's her as a widow in the later years of her life. And I think it's possible that she just had the money and the prestige to do it. And so that made it another sort of outward symbol of status and reputation, things that she's sort of representing in the painting itself. But I also think it's possible that she wanted to choose how she would be remembered by her descendants. This was the image of herself that she wanted to pass down to her family. And 250 years later, we still have it to reflect on. Either way, every detail of this portrait is a reflection of her choices about how she wanted to be represented. And I think that that's a very powerful thing. And so passing into sort of like the last years of her life, she survives a stroke. In 1820, she suffers from a stroke that left the entire right side of her body paralyzed. She was moved into a bedroom on the bottom floor and would have required round-the-clock care from this point on, which would have been provided either by one of her daughters, two of which remain unmarried, or an enslaved woman. The object that's on the left of your screen is what's called an invalid feeder. So the spout would have been used to feed injured or aging people who were unable to feed themselves. The cup would have been filled with either a liquid or a soft semi-liquid food. The spout would have been placed in the person's mouth, and that sort of strainer that you can see in the bottom left photograph would have prevented large pieces of food from going into the spout, ensuring that the individual didn't choke. And so I include this just sort of as a reminder of not only did she survive a stroke at 78 years of age, but she's also surviving the stroke really before modern medicine, before the assistance that offers, which is really pretty remarkable. And I include on the right a photograph of Sarahbush's sick room as it's interpreted today at the Bush-Holley House. And the two beds in the photograph are an accurate recreation of what's described in the inventory of Sarah's will, so what approximately would have been in the room at the time of her death. And so her sick room with these two beds, the one canopied and the one sort of almost like trundle type bed, really show that despite her stroke and the really deep level of intimacy that this kind of care would have required, the boundaries of decorum and power remain. Sarah is still in the canopied, sort of more luxurious bed, and her carer is still in this, very simplified, low to the ground, resting. The inventory of her will also states that 7 chairs were in this room at the time of her death. If you look, you can see that the room is really pretty small for 7 chairs. I believe that this was a result of her family gathering around her in her final moments to say goodbye and sit vigil. So even in her final moments, Sarah was a central figure for the Bush family who was respected and cared for. So I also want to take a look at her will. I think it's a particularly remarkable document because at this point in time, women had actually only had the legal right to leave a will for about 15 years. Connecticut passes a law allowing women to do so in 1809. And in her will, her first son, Eustace Luke, does inherit the majority of the estate. But the main difference that I want to touch on between Sarah's will and her late husband David's will is that Sarah's will really, in its own way, favors her daughters. She leaves them larger sums of money than she leaves her individual sons. And she gives them this money in full, not in trust. They have it at that moment to do what they will with, as well as objects to help them maintain a household. This brings us back to this question that we asked earlier about what caring for someone looks like and how Sarah's experiences in the world as a woman might have led her to make a very different choice from her husband. So that is Sarah's life. Hopefully you got the impression that she's an extremely powerful woman. She manages to create for herself a reputation as being very capable, a really strong foundation for the rest of her family. But one of the things that can make Sarah's life so difficult to talk about is the fact that she lived through all of these incredible historic moments and clearly suffers a lot of hardship throughout her life. And despite all that, does manage to be, very respected and very strong and very capable. But the reality is also that she was able to accomplish so much and gain this reputation of capability, at least in part due to the hard labor of the people who she enslaved. And so on that note, I am going to pass off to Heather, who will be discussing one of the enslaved women in the Bush-Holley House, Patience.
Wonderful. Thank you, Kelsie. I'm going to take over sharing screens. Lovely. Ooh, that is my final slide. Sorry, friends. All right, so I'm Heather, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Patience. So Patience lived in the Bush-Holley House as the same time as Sarah did. She is one of 15 enslaved individuals who live in the Bush household over the years, and she is the one responsible for much of the work that's being done in the house that goes largely unnoticed, the daily grind of it all, the cooking, the cleaning, and the caring for the children. So we're going to talk a little bit about her. So I want to start with this. If her work is invisible, how do we know about Patience? We, like Sarah, do not have any diaries from Patience. We only have legal records. And in all of these legal records about Patience, only 2 of them mention her by name. One is David Bush's will, in which she is willed to Sarah Bush. And the other one is a record on the birth of her children. The rest of our documents that regard Patience come from a series of legal documents held by the town in censuses. And it's from these that we're able to derive the details of her life, along with some basic understanding of the common practices of the day. And I want to touch upon slavery in the Bush household. Now, slavery is common in Connecticut at this time. The slavery existed here in the North, New England. Connecticut was actually the largest slaveholding state in New England. Most farmers, priests, doctors, lawyers were enslavers as well. The Bush family was the largest slaveholding family in Greenwich. Most families who were enslavers only enslaved 1 or 2 people. That's the typical Connecticut practice. But as I mentioned briefly before, the Bushes enslaved 15 people. And these enslaved individuals ran much of the Bushes' farm, mill, and household. They lived in an attic space in the house we've interpreted today as our interpreted enslaved quarters. At one point, up to 10 people would have lived in this attic space. It is a room without windows, without a fireplace. It is dark, it is cold in the winter, and it is hot in the summer. It is not a pleasant place to live. And it is attached directly to the main Bush household, which means the enslaved people who live in this space do not have a space that is truly their own. It is used for storage, for drying herbs and keeping things over the winter. And on the other side of the wall are the people who enslaved them. Patience is the longest serving enslaved member of the Bush household. She lives here for over 40 years. So who is Patience in the house? In 1790, which is the time of the first American census, there are 3 enslaved women in the Bush household. Their names are Patience, Candace, and Peggy. Patience is the oldest. At this time, she's probably in her mid-20s. The other 2 are preteens or young teenagers, somewhere between the age of 11 and 14. They're much younger than Patience by at least a decade, which means she serves as their mentor, their teacher, and their mother figure. She is the only older enslaved woman in the house and the only person these younger girls can really look to for help. In the early days of our known records of Patience, because of this age difference, she bears most of the responsibility for keeping the house going. The chores that her and the other enslaved women would have been in charge of in the house fall under her jurisdiction. So what are those chores? The biggest one is going to be cooking. So at its height, there are 19 people living in the Bush household between the Bushes, the enslaved population, and the paid servants. So take a moment, 19 people, they all get 3 meals a day. That is 57 meals that Patience is responsible for cooking daily. My goodness. Sarah probably would have set the menu, would have told Patience what was expected to be served, but Patience was the one who would be cooking it. She would be the first one awake in the morning, hours before dawn, before the others in the household woke up, to start the fire and begin heating and prepping for the day. She would have also been in charge of cooking for special events. The Bushes, being a wealthy mercantile family, often had guests over, other wealthy merchants and generals like General Putnam. When these guests would come over, it was expected that a special meal or a special tea be served. Patience would have been in charge of creating these more intricate meals. She also would have been the one who was planning for the prepping for the winter. In the days before refrigeration and before grocery stores, if you wanted to eat in the winter, that was food that you were largely preserving in the fall. So to continue to make those 57 meals a day, she was basically, for the months of autumn, cooking twice as much as that, just to ensure that there would be preserved food during the cold months. She's also in charge of the cleaning and housekeeping, the daily kind of dirty duties that would have been seen as beneath Sarah. Well, she was entertaining guests in this fabulous parlor, which we've interpreted here. Patience was the one doing the laundry, mending the clothes, washing the dishes, washing the floors, making soap, beating rugs, polishing silver, dusting, lighting, and keeping fires. Now, I want to imagine doing all of these chores in the days before modern technology. In this time period, just doing the laundry is a 3-day process. The first day, you spot the clothing and the sheets with chemicals that you have put together, often made out of lye. You let them set on the stains. The second day, you have to manually wash everything in buckets of water that you bring up from the well and that you heat on a fire. You know that rumble function that your washing machine has that swishes everything back and forth? You are that rumble function. You are doing it by hand with a stick. And this is for hours to keep it going, to wash the cloth properly. And then the next day you have to iron it with actual irons that are kept in the fireplace and set it out to dry. And that's just one of these chores. It is a long day in Patience's life. Not every one of these things would have been done daily, but most of them would have been done at least weekly. Patience also serves as Sarahbush's personal servant. What does that mean? It means that Patience is the one attending to Sarah. She helps her dress in the morning and undress at night. This is a time when women are wearing a lot of different layers, and a woman of Sarah's class would have had some very complicated folding and tying that needed to be done for her dress. Patience would have helped her with that. It's a very intimate process. She would have also kept her room, cleaned it, swept it, kept the fires going, warmed the beds before Sarah went to bed. She would have been in charge of mending Sarah's clothing, all those little rips and wears that appear on cloth. She would have been the one to keep them in check. She also would have been the one caring for Sarah when she was sick or pregnant, helping her walk, helping her go to the restroom, helping her do whatever she needed while she was ill. It is quite common for the personal servants of enslaved people who are personal servants to, in a way, be the closest ones to their enslavers. It's a fascinating dance where you are this intimately connected to someone, but this someone is not your friend. They are someone who is keeping you there against your will and who you have to listen to a certain extent. They're not your friends, but you know them more intimately than anyone else. She also helped Sarah with raising children. Now, Patience would not have been there for the children that were born in Sarah's first marriage, but she would have been there for the 5 children, likely, that Sarah had when she was married to David Bush. She would have helped raise these children and helped raise the older children who existed in the house at the same time. A lot of the kind of social etiquette and networking and higher education would have fallen to Sarah, but the day-to-day realities of feeding and changing and washing the kids, especially when they were very young, would have likely been Patience's job. So we've talked a lot about Patience and what she does in the house, but it's important to remember that she is a full person. She is more than an enslaved woman or a house servant. She is a human being with a life beyond this work. So who is she when she is not serving the Bushes? Well, Patience is a life partner and a mother. She is common law married, let's say, to another enslaved person in the household. His name is Bush Sr. She and Cole will have 6 children of their own over the years. The names are Phyllis, Millie, Rose, Nancy, and Cole Jr. They're all born in the Bush-Holley House, probably within the enslaved quarter attic in which she lived. And I will be honest, most of these children are taken from her quite young. The 5 girls all disappear from the censuses by the time they're around 10 years old. So she is raising Sarah's children while she is watching her children be sent to other households to work away from her. Her son, though, Cole Jr., gets to stay with her for most of his childhood. Patience is also a friend and a mentor and a family figure to Candace and her children. Now, I mentioned earlier that in the early days, there were 3 enslaved women, Patience, Candace, and Peggy. Patience was a young adult and Candace was a child. Well, Peggy is sold, but Candace stays in the house. She grows up next to Patience. She is somewhere between a daughter and a niece and a sister to her. And eventually, Candace will have 2 children of her own, Jack and Hester. They're of similar ages as Patience's youngest children. They would have played together. They would have slept in the same space. They would have been the world to each other, the person that they knew best. Now, at this point, I want to talk about the Gradual Emancipation Acts, because with these children, this becomes very important. So what are the Gradual Emancipation Acts? Well, the Gradual Emancipation Acts are a series of laws that start in 1784. They're very long and complicated, but the big takeaways from it is that they free the children of enslaved women when they turn 21 years old. That is the gradual emancipation. One day slavery will end as people age out of it. It also makes adults who are born before the Gradual Emancipation Acts eligible for freedom if they are between the ages of 25 and 45, have an enslaver who is willing to free them, and have a doctor's note saying that they are healthy. What this means is that all of Patience's children will one day be free. And I can't think of anything that might mean more to her as a mother. It also means that eventually her partner, Cull, is going to be freed. 2 years after the birth of their youngest child, Cull Sr. is freed by the Bush family. This leaves Patience in an interesting position. No doubt she is very happy for Cull. She wants the best for him, but it also means that she and her children are living without their husband and father in the Bush household. She is raising these children more or less by herself. We do not know how often Cull is able to see them while he is free and they are still enslaved. He stays in Greenwich though, and he moves quite close to the Bush-Holley House, no doubt to stay close to his family. Patience herself will never be freed. And I want you to take in kind of the bittersweetness of that. As a mother, I'm sure what she wanted most in the world was a better life for her children. And that's a better life that she knows that they are going to have. They are going to be free. They are going to be able to make their own choices and make their own way in the world. But as they are freed, they leave her. And eventually she is the last enslaved person in the Bush-Holley House until she dies in her 60s. So who is Patience? Patience is an incredible woman. She is strong and capable and amazing. She is the one behind the scenes running the day-to-day realities of a large and influential household. She is the one cooking the meals, cleaning the house, and caring for the children. She helps raise over a dozen children between hers and Candace's and Sarahbush's. 6 of them were her own. And she is someone who knew that there was a brighter future coming. It might not be for her, but she knew it was there. And I'm sure that she gave her children and her family everything that she could to help them reach it. So on this note, we are going to leave the colonial and revolutionary eras of the Bush-Holley House, and we're going to pop 100 years into the future, where my coworker Maggie is going to tell you about the other half of the Bush-Holley House, the Holley family.
Heather, thank you so much. Thanks for that beautiful introduction. I'm just going to go ahead and put my portion of the slide here on this, or slides on the screen. Before I start, I just want to thank both Heather and Kelsie for giving what I think is such a really deep and rich overview of the lives of some of these particular individuals, these women who really shaped this early history of the Bush-Holley House, and whose lives and telling those stories make a big part of how we interpret that house's history today. So as Heather mentioned, I'm really going to now take us further into the future, about a century forward. So we're leaving behind the early 19th century And now we're moving into about the 1890s, into the Holley era of the Bush-Holley House. So in this last portion of our program this evening, I'm going to give us a glimpse specifically into the Holley women in Cos Cob. And so specifically who I'm going to be focusing on and talking about here is the mother and daughter, Josephine Lyon Holley and Emma Constant Holley, later Emma Constant Holley McCrae. And just to give you a very brief sense of history here, the Bush family, so Justice and Sally Bush, were living in what we now refer to as the Bush-Holley House until 1844. They moved away from the house in 1844, and there were a series of other owners who lived there through the 19th century, including the Smith family, who lived there for a period of time between 1848 and 1875, also the Wellsted family. But in 1882, rather, Josephine and Edward P. Holley moved into the house. And right away, they began renting, basically offering rented rooms for paying guests, for boarders. And many of these guests were folks who were coming to Cos Cob, often by railroad. The Cos Cob train station on the New Haven line had opened in the late 1840s. And so suddenly this waterfront community, this kind of formerly very sort of business-based waterfront community, became a popular vacation spot. And so the Holleys ran this very busy boarding house. Now, when they had moved into this house, they had 3 children. Their oldest son was Edward Jr. They had a daughter, Josephine, and then their youngest daughter was Emma Constant. And sadly, their middle daughter, Josephine, died during a measles outbreak in 1887 at the age of 18. But both Edward, the older son, and Emma Constant, the younger daughter, lived into adulthood. And in fact, Constant, who was the youngest, and so what you're looking at here, by the way, is a photograph of Constant standing with the dark long skirt and the beautiful shirtwaist. Her mother, Josephine, is seated, and they're sitting here on the lower front porch of what they would have called the old house. Today we call the Bush-Holley House. Emma Constant really grew up and stayed at the Holley House, at the boarding house, through her adulthood. And as we'll see, she really became integral to the life and the operation of this boarding house as a business. You know, what we're looking at here on the left is a photograph of a very young Emma Constant Holley. And then on the right here, she's depicted sort of from the back with her bicycle, probably about 1890, standing at behind the rear L of the Bush-Holley House, as it's called today. Now, I want to mention, so Edward, Emma Constant's father, Edward P. Holley, he's often referred to as really the proprietor of the Holley boarding house. But truly, we really know that he had other interests and other endeavors that he was really sort of more so focused on during the years that the Holley family lived in Cos Cob. The photograph on the left here is Edward Holley later in life. On the right, what you're looking at is the grist mill, the old grist mill that in fact David Bush had built right on the waterfront just across Strickland Road from the Bush-Holley House in the 18th century. When the Holleys moved to Cos Cob, it was still standing, and in fact Edward Holley had basically taken over the operation of the mill. All of the millstones and everything were still working, so he was grinding and selling animal feed and flour, limestone as well, or grinding lime for making lime, cement and other materials. At least he was doing that until 1899, when sadly the mill burned in a fire along with a lot of the other buildings that lined the waterfront. And really around the time of that fire, sort of really towards the end of the 19th, moving into the 20th century, we know that Edward Holley spent increasingly a lot of time in the winters, especially traveling. He would travel to tropical climates presumably because of his health. So he spent time in Cuba, he spent time in Florida. In fact, he died in 1913 while he was on a trip to Cuba. And so we know that after about 1899, or even probably before that, his wife Josephine and their daughter Constance Holley were really the ones who were making most of the financial decisions, logistical decisions, and really running the business of the boarding house itself. Now, the era that I'm talking about now, so right around 1890, this is the period when Cos Cob and the Holleys boarding house especially became this center of a group of artists, writers, and cultural figures that we refer to today as the Cos Cob colony, the American Impressionism, the Cos Cob art colony. What we're looking at right now, see these photographs of Childe Hassam on the left, John Henry Twachtman here at center, photographed with one of his students, and then on the far right, seated, is the painter Theodore Robinson. I mean, these are three of some of the principal figures that really we associate with this Cos Cob school of American Impressionism. Twachtman, John Henry Twachtman, is really sort of a central, crucial figure to this group. It's a little bit, outside of the realm of what I'll talk about tonight, but suffice to say that for both Twachtman and then his close friend Hassam and Robinson, the views that they're painting of the lower landing here in Cos Cob, of the shipping businesses, the buildings here, the marshes, the waterfront community, these really become associated with both this era of American Impressionism and sort of coastal Connecticut art colonies, specifically the Cos Cob colony, still to this day. This is really kind of the bread and butter of the Cos Cob colony. And some of these artists, Hassam included, really did some of their most recognizable work here in Cos Cob, and not just in Cos Cob, but in the environs or immediately inside the Holley House. So what we're looking at right now is one of Hassam's sort of really iconic paintings, one of his most recognizable canvases. This one's titled The Goldfish Window. It's in the collection of the Courier Museum of Art up in Manchester, New Hampshire. And it's one of several series that Hassam painted of, women that were in these interiors within the Holley House. In this case, we know that the young woman with the red hair who's wearing this beautiful kimono, who was modeling for Hassam, was actually a young woman by the name of Helen Burke. Her father was Tobias Burke. He was an Irish immigrant who ran a saloon that the sort of locals affectionately referred to as Toby's Tavern. And in fact, even today, as part of visiting the Greenwich Historical Society's campus, you are able to visit the structure where Toby's Tavern was located. It's now part of our museum and library building. This is a view of a painting that's actually part of our collection at the Greenwich Historical Society. So in fact, you can see this painting if you come and take a tour of the Bush-Holley House. In fact, it's hanging today in the same room where it was painted. So this is the room that we refer to now as the best bedroom in the Bush-Holley House. It's a ground floor bedroom. It's just off of the dining room. And in fact, we know that Hassam, and of course, this is a painting by Childe Hassam, both he and his wife would often stay in this bedroom while they were boarding with the Holleys, which they did many, many times between 1896 and 1918. So over a 20-year period that they were consistently visiting the Holley family. Now, within this era, and we know for a fact, or we were quite sure anyway, that the model in this painting is probably Maud Hassam, who's Childe Hassam's wife. We know that they were frequently boarding here, and the reason that we can say that we know that they kind of favored this particular bedroom when they were staying at the Holley House is partially because of paintings like this, where we can actually sort of see that same exact interior represented. But frankly, it's also because we have primary source material in the form of letters, correspondence that was written by Constance Holley to her mother. So in the case of the letter that I have quoted here, this is from a letter that Constance Holley wrote to her mother in October of 1902. At this point, Constance was really kind of overseeing the business the guests and the ins and outs of who was coming and going, and was writing to her mother basically about, how much should I be charging people? What is the sort of going rate that I should be paying for the heat and coal? And she's mentioning here that the Hassams are settled in this big bedroom that's downstairs. They have the stove up and everything. Mrs. Hassam says that they always sleep together in cold weather, so they just have the big bed. So she's, getting into some of the ins and outs of what it's like to actually kind of be among these artists. We have another letter that's really kind of fun, in which she can't help it, but she's sort of bragging to her mother about how much Mr. Hassam, who at this point is quite a well-known and really famous artist, he apparently was praising the way that she had decorated or set the dining room table, saying that it's the prettiest table decoration he'd ever seen, candelabrum in the center, and pine that from the corners of the table, silver candlesticks on the ends. We all had a jolly time. So this is in December of 1902. So it's sort of a holiday meal that she's discussing. One thing I do want to mention, in kind of talking about the Holleys and their running of the boarding house, what we're looking at here is another painting that's in the dining room of the Bush-Holley House today. And so this is a portrait of Josephine Holley in 1912, and she's sitting in the corner of that dining room. Obviously the Holleys themselves were very friendly with these artists, these kind of worldly characters who were coming and staying with them. Some of these people were young art students, and they themselves were sort of able to participate in this kind of upper middle class cultural milieu. They weren't necessarily wealthy themselves. They really relied on the income from having these paying guests. We also know for certain that they employed a number of servants. And so we have a photograph here. Unfortunately, we don't know precisely the identities of the women that are photographed, but here they're standing outside of the sort of back kitchen wing of the Holley House. But we know that for cooking, for cleaning, for other domestic tasks, the Holleys certainly had hired labor. And in fact, if you take a look at the census that was done in 1900, the entry for the Holley House, or the old house, you can see that at the time of that census, there were two young women, two Irish women that were living at the Holley House. It's Mary and Margaret Smith. They're likely sisters. They're 18 and 20 years old. And they're cooking and they're cleaning and they're doing some of the other work that, Constance and her mother, Josephine, really relied on in order to keep the household running. In 1900, Emma Constant was married. In fact, she married a young painter named Elmer Livingston McCrae, who had been a student of John Henry Twachtman's. The photograph you see on your right here is a young Elmer McCrae on the porch of the Holley House painting. McCrae ended up moving. He moved here to Cos Cob, and he and Emma Constant, eventually inherited the house itself and really took over the running of the business from Emma Constant's parents. And then in 1904, Emma Constant gave birth to their daughters, the twins, Clarissa and Constant, who we see photographed here, probably in about 1908. They look like they're maybe about 4 years old. And lucky for us, both Emma Constant and the twins really became frequent subjects for Elmer McCrae for his paintings, his pastels. We're looking here at a really lovely kind of sweet family portrait that actually hangs today in the dining room of the Bush-Holley House. You can see it there if you come to visit us. What I will mention here is that at the end of her life, really one of the most significant things that Emma Constant Holley McCrae had done, in the eyes of those of us who work here today, is she was the one to sell her house, the Holley House, the old house, to the Greenwich Historical Society. So this happened in 1957. And at the time that she sold the house, she also bequeathed a barn that was full of paintings by her husband, much of the furniture and furnishings that they had had in the house over the years, which are still part of our collection today, plus a whole trove of family papers, correspondence, journals, diaries, newspaper clippings, and photographs. And so really, we have such a wealth of insight and information about the Holleys, about the McCraes, and their lives. So just to kind of compare that for a moment to, you know, as Kelsie was mentioning, or as Heather was detailing, the relative sort of paucity of specific details that we know, even about the lives of someone like David Bush or his son, who were these you know, wealthy merchants, and certainly about the lives of someone like Patience or Candace or Hester, who were enslaved people who were living and working in this household. I mean, in those cases, so much of what we're able to tell people about their lives is really inferred from tiny footnotes in legal documents and a lot of kind of casting around for what we can say based on, you know, historical precedent or information gleaned from other sources. So just to kind of give you a sample of what we know about someone like Emma Constant, Holley McCrae, we know that apart from her life spent running the business of this boarding house, we know that she was a devoted gardener. She had some training in botany. In fact, what we're looking at here, alongside a photograph of Constant Holley, is one of her sort of text pamphlets that come from her years as a student at Greenwich Academy. In the attic of the Bush-Holley House, actually, sometime in the 1980s, were discovered these series of over 50 examples of dried and pressed botanical specimens that we believe were collected by Constant Holley when she was probably in her early 20s. So once again, someone who had a real interest in studying botanicals, sort of scientific classification. Her interest in floral design, in flowers, was something that really became, I would say, the major creative force in her life. She became, especially as she became older, one of not just sort of a locally famous, but in many ways sort of a nationally known, or at least published, authority on floral design. She was a founding member of the Greenwich Garden Club. And not only was she eventually a very sort of sought after speaker and sort of teacher in the art of floral design, she was also published in several popular books on the topic. She was invited to exhibit some of her designs at the 1939 World's Fair. One thing that we kind of know is that Constant Holley had credited her interest in flowers and in floral design as an art form in general to someone who she refers to as a Japanese gentleman who essentially kind of introduced to her the art of ikebana style floral design. Most likely this was a young artist from Japan named Genjiro Eto, who we know spent many years, or at least several summers, at the Holley House. So very likely this is something that Constant Holley was kind of learning and then adapting and turning into sort of her own pursuit. We also know that Constant and her husband and their daughters and her mother, in fact, were very civically engaged. They were politically minded. They were involved in progressive causes. You know, up here on the upper left, we actually have Constant Holley McCrae's membership card to the Connecticut Women's Suffrage Association. So this is the statewide organization that was advocating for voting rights for women in the early 20th century. Both of the Holley McCraes were both members of the Greenwich Equal Suffrage League as well. And then on the lower right here, we have a membership card for Mrs. Constant and Clarissa McCrae. So these are the twins from 1914. So when they were 10 years old, this is their membership card in the National Junior Suffrage Corps. So this was a national organization, once again, devoted to raising consciousness about voting rights, equal voting rights among young people. And not only was there a branch that was founded here in Greenwich, and Constant and Clarissa were some of the founding members, the little 10-year-old members, but that insignia that's up in the upper left-hand corner, that kind of sort of windswept pine tree on the yellow background, was designed by their father, by Elmer McCrae. And it was used nationally as the symbol for that organization. So I'm going to just sort of, with an eye for the time, kind of wrap up my portion of this evening. I know that we wanted to have an opportunity to have some questions as well, but I wanted to leave you all with just this photograph that I really love of Emma Constant. She's seated in the room which at the time and then today as well, we interpret as Elmer McCrae's studio. So this is up on the second floor of the Bush-Holley House. And in fact, one of those portraits on the floor of a woman who's sort of with her back to us is one of her husband's portraits of her. So I do think that, you know, the opportunity to kind of talk about the history of the Bush-Holley House through the lens of the women who lived there is always one that's exciting for us. And I think it gives kind of a different view into this part of history. And the one thing that I will say, I think, to conclude before we take questions, is I do want to give a plug to two upcoming tours that we're going to be doing this month as part of Women's History Month at the Greenwich Historical Society. And so on Saturday, March 12th, Kelsie is going to be leading a special tour of the Bush-Holley House. The title of that tour is going to be The Holley Women and the Cos Cob Art Colony. So it'll be a tour sort of talking about that progressive era history, a little bit of something that was some of the things that were touched upon tonight, but, you know, within the space of the Bush-Holley House and a little bit more in depth. And then Heather Lodge, 2 weeks later on Saturday, March 26th, is going to be leading another tour called Womanhood, I should say, and Enslaved Narratives in the Bush Family Household. And so once again, she's going to be giving sort of a more in-depth discussion of the realities of the life of enslaved women, specifically in the Bush-Holley House. So both of those tours are going to be at 12 o'clock, and you can buy your tickets on our website. And I hope that people will come and join. And so I'm going to sort of wrap it up there and say thanks to my colleagues and Miguel for having us.
Maggie, thank you so much. Thank you to Kelsie, and thank you to Heather. Please visit the Greenwich Historical Society, where history comes alive. And now we're ready for questions. Any questions? I see that someone wrote, great job, everyone. Love the amplification of all these strong women. Okay, let's go up and see. Did Elmer McCrae receive any recognition as an artist?
I can jump in and give a little bit of background on that.
Okay.
The short answer is yes, but sort of in a relative manner. You know, he's Elmer McCrae. Well, he's somebody who certainly was exhibiting in his lifetime, and he was mixing it up in the New York art scene. He, you know, today doesn't have that same kind of broad recognition, certainly, that someone like Twachtman, Robinson, or Hassam do. Significantly, I mean, one of his major contributions to kind of the national American art scene is he was part of a group of folks who made up the organization that mounted the very famous show, which we now refer to as the Armory Show, in New York City in 1913. So this was kind of this landmark exhibition that really introduced European modernism and Cubism and all of these very avant-garde movements to American audiences. So McCrae, along with Walt Kuhn and a couple of other sort of major players, were really the ones that organized that show. So for that reason, he really has this kind of, you know, major legacy. We have a lot of really amazing works of his here as part of our collection, and there are many of them out there. There's some pieces at the Hirshhorn Museum in DC, part of the Smithsonian. So he's out there, but he is a little bit more of kind of a locally known artist.
Thank you, Maggie. And our next comment is, if anyone wants, the Holley women are such a contrast to Florence Gilsworth, who was, I believe, against suffrage. Any comment?
That's right. That's totally true. Yeah. And it's interesting. I mean, you know, without going too much into talking about Florence Griswold, but there certainly was an entire, you know, faction, or not just faction, but large group of women who were quite opposed to the idea of women's suffrage for various reasons. The Holleys, I mean, just judging from the company that they kept and the kind of, you know, interest that they had, the kind of literature they were reading, they clearly kind of subscribed to a very progressive set of political ideals. And so the, you know, votes for women, you know, better education for women, these were all things that they believed in, and were a little bit more prevalent, I think, in their community of artists, I should say.
Thank you, Maggie. Theodore Robinson is looking so artistic. The smock, the beret, how very Francais.
Yeah, he looks good.
Okay, and our next question is, why did the Bush family sell the house and property?
I think I can handle that one. So eventually the Bush house is sold, I believe it's 1848. And so Eustace Luke Bush, the one who I mentioned sort of towards the end of my presentation, who inherits the house, he actually, turns out he did not also inherit the money-making gene from his parents. And so he makes some sort of poor business investments. Companies sort of start to fail. And again, that loyalist suspicion that really sort of clouded the family in the last years of David's life, that really sticks, and it makes it more difficult for them to do business in town. So with a combination of those factors, Eustace Luke Bush, actually, when he dies about $13,000 in debt, which for the time period is a massive amount of debt. So that is probably what leads to the selling of Bush-Holley House.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if you guys have anything you want to add, but and then from there, it's goes through a couple other families. It is turned into a boarding house, and the Holleys begin renting it in 1882. So there's like nearly a 40-year period difference between when it goes out of the Bush family and enters into the Holley family.
Why was Patience not eligible for emancipation?
So the sad truth of that is she probably was eligible for emancipation. So she is born at least a decade before the Gradual Emancipation Act, but that clause that allows 25 through 45-year-olds to be freed with a doctor's notice would have applied to her. It applies to her husband. What is missing is honestly the will of the Bushes. She was the right age for 20 years to be freed. She is very likely to have been healthy enough to be freed, as she did have 6 children, but the Bushes decided not to free her. And with the laws of the time, that was their right. Slavery would not be completely outlawed in Connecticut until 1848. So 12 years after Patience's death.
Do we know where she's buried?
We don't know where she was buried, unfortunately. So she's likely to have been buried somewhere on the Bush property, perhaps in an unmarked grave in the Bush family grave plot. but we cannot confirm that. There's no record of her burial.
Any more questions from our public?
Heather, we do know where Hester and Candace are buried. Can you talk about that a
Yes.
little bit?
Yes, so we do know where Hester and Candace are buried. So Candace, the young woman who is a child when Patience is an adult in the early census, she goes on to have a daughter named Hester. And Hester is a truly, truly remarkable woman. After she's freed at age 21, we don't exactly know what she does to make a living, but we know that eventually she is able to get a house for her and her mother and her son to live in. And in her will, she puts in it, well, first of all, she has a will, and it is a will that shows that she has books and dresses and money. And part of that money is set aside to put a headstone down for her mother and herself. And they are the only two enslaved or formerly enslaved people in Greenwich to have headstones. They're buried at Union Cemetery, which had just opened itself to having people of color buried in the plots about 5 years before their deaths. So you can go visit them. It's really sweet. Candace's headstone says, "Beloved Mother."
Great. Were there a lot of women artists who were part of the Coscup Art Colony? And this will be our last question.
Well, the short answer is yes. In terms of those who kind of have that same national profile that's lasted for years, I mean, the probably the two most prominent that come to mind are Alice Judson, Carolyn Mays. The truth is that many of Twachtman's students, so these are students that would travel, they were enrolled in the Art Students League, which was one of this, really preeminent art schools in New York City at the time. And they would sign up to take these summer art courses in Coscup. Many of them were women, they were young women, they were probably unmarried. I mean, this is a generation where it's really some of the first American women who were probably pursuing this type of artistic study. They would have done figure drawing at the Art Students League, not necessarily nude figure drawing, but still, I mean, they were often studying art with an eye toward a professional career. The truth, frankly, is that as sort of a general rule, we don't necessarily have a lot of accounts of those young women, at least not yet, or at least not those that we sort of tracked down. The one artist that I mentioned, Carolyn Mays, wrote a really sort of evocative account, a retrospective sort of memoir, short article in 1920s that was kind of reflecting upon her time as a student in Coscup. And in fact, a lot of what we know about sort of the life of these young art students comes from that article. So the answer is yes. And the answer also is that we need to do some more work to learn more about them.
Ladies, thank you so much, and thank you all. And of course, don't forget to visit the Greenwich Historical Society. And of course, come to the Byram Shubert Library. Check out library materials for free. Thank you, everyone. Ladies, thank you for this wonderful collaboration. I hope we will continue to work in the future. I know we will. And don't forget next week, a lecture. We're continuing our celebration of Women's History Month here at the Byram Shubert Library with a wonderful lecture on women in contemporary French film with Professor Anne Kern. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for coming. Ladies, thank you, thank you, thank you. I learned a lot. Thank you so much. And our public was fascinated. So thank you, ladies. You're wonderful.
Thanks for having us, Miguel.
Oh, it's really my pleasure.